So one thing that seemed to come out at me from that talk, I think for a long time the narrative was always modular design, off-site design, whatever it means. People think a kind of post-war, cookie-cutter, crap buildings falling apart, poor design. I kind of got from your talk, and a few other people touched on this, that the quality of traditional build isn't necessarily that good, and maybe there's a market shift coming where people are recognising the quality of these things is better, and actually maybe they don't care how the thing's built. If the design is the right quality, no one gives a toss whether it's made in a factory or made in site. I think a lot of this is driven by clients. Do you think we're ready for it? Do you think the market is now getting to a point where it's starting to care less about these things and the market is ready for this? Because that was always one of the kind of perceived blockers, and I'm sort of looking at you, Chris, but I think a load of you touched on this.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I'd say is the cookie cutter sort of phrase is often thrown out there, but if you look at what we've done in particularly low-rise housing, cookie cuttering, sorry, can't get my words out, is what the traditional house builders have been doing for years. So that's probably the first thing. I think what's interesting, and what was interesting in our journey was we had the first 44 residents move in at New Islington, and if you looked at all of our marketing material, a lot of it was off-site manufacturing first. It was a design-led home. Oh, you've got choices. We went back and did some feedback from all 44 residents, and basically the strongest thing that came back, and it was sort of right there in your face, was actually the customization, which everybody loved. So now, when you look at a lot of our marketing material, it's a bespokely designed house by you. It's a design-led house. Oh, by the way, it's manufactured in a factory, and it was kind of absolutely the biggest thing for us is it's not an alternative method of construction. It becomes just another form of construction.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to pick up on that or comment on that?
I guess something I'd add is I use the iPod as a great example of a device that changed what consumers expected from that device. So other MP3 players existed before the iPod, and I know because I had some of them, and they'd store one CD. And what Apple did is they looked at what a consumer wanted from a product and just ignored what had been done before and came up with something that was over 3 times more expensive that everyone was queuing to buy. And I'd encourage, off-site house builders to think about what is it people actually want from a house. My grandma was living on her own till she was 92, and I wish I'd had some sort of home surveillance monitoring system that told me she was drinking and eating and getting up and getting about. And that technology exists. So why don't we have it? Why don't we have central locking on our houses and climate control and all of these other technologies? Because I know that I, as a consumer, would love it. And it also then differentiates other than just the where it is, how much it is, and how many bedrooms.
Yeah. So one thing a number of you touched on, the sort of its design for manufacturing assembly point. So we often talk about a skills gap in the industry, and I think when people say that, they're generally talking about on-site skills. Do you think there's actually a design skills gap? That a number of you mentioned the fact that it's designed for manufacturing assembly, but if the designers don't know how to do that, it leads to the kind of retrofitting of design. Do you think that's true? Do you think that's something the industry is willing to admit to itself yet?
I don't think it's willing to admit it to itself, no. But I think it exists. We have recently sort of embarked on a kind of more integrated DFMA journey, and without naming names, we had a pretty small pool of experienced consultants, integrated consultants that we could go to for that. So coming back to my earlier point, I think it's something that we've forgotten. As an architect, I think it's something our profession has forgotten. This used to be second nature to us. We would design to the constraints of our supply chain, not try and shoehorn in some image of what the consumer might want or what we might want into that supply chain. And we need to get that back. And it's not that difficult. And I think it is about discipline, but it's also about starting off on that basis, and it's a philosophy as much as it is anything else. But the tools, I think, help. It's not about bombarding the industry with loads of new rules. It's just about being smarter.
I think the vertical integration is massive as well in that. You know, having that vertical integration, so from the very outset, you can start off on that process and you know, we're probably quite fortunate in that front as clients to say, right from the outset, we are going to go off-site. So actually, from its very concept, it's designed in that approach.
Yeah, I think I'd say that from a quality perspective or from a design perspective, I think there's a general acceptance now that a factory-built product should be a higher quality than a site-based product. But I think we find there's still a bit of reluctance and resistance for all of those designers actually to accept that off-site manufacturing is a positive thing, and getting over this issue of standardisation. Off-site manufacturing equals poor quality design, so not poor quality product, but poor quality design. And I think that, you know, I speak to a lot of people and they say, yeah, we want to do a modular building, we don't want it to look like modular. And I talk to people who say, well, you know, you standardise things and actually you're losing some quality out of what you could do by a traditional building. And I think that, you know, the industry needs to move on and accept that this is the way we need to do things. When we talk about productivity and we talk about all of those things that we all sit here and know there's a massive issue coming with our skill shortage, then but I do find that.
Yeah.
So from me being ever the troublemaker, I had a boss who was ex-Toyota, and he was a senior plant manager, so he was responsible for making cars or bits of cars. Whenever they designed a new car, all of the senior plant managers globally would have to go and make the first 200 vehicles along with the people who designed those cars. And they were within their power to say, I'm not accepting this as a design because I can't make it, or because it means that my guys or girls on the line are going to have to do something that's dangerous or is not good for their health. And the designers would have to come up with a solution either through changing the design or coming up with special tooling or special fixturing to accommodate the needs of the people who are going to make it. So it's not necessarily the designers forgetting the skills, it's actually go and do it. Yeah, and experience that pain.
So I've got loads more questions, but I'll shut up now. Have we got any questions from the floor? I'm sure there must be. Here we go, Keith.
Good afternoon, Keith Waller, Programme Director for the Construction Innovation Hub. Firstly, Jaimie, can I say it's a great pleasure to hear you continuing your on-stage swearing from last week. Thank you very much for that.
Have I sworn?
Oh yeah, just a question for the four panellists. If we were thinking about the top 20 construction companies in the UK today, and we project forward 10 years from now, how many of those top 20 construction companies will actually be construction companies? How many will be manufacturing companies? How many will be technology companies? And how many will be data companies? So we've always had a top 20 contractors made up of contractors. What's it going to be in 10 years' time? What's the split between those, Mark?
And then the rest of it. It's interesting you say that, Keith. I did an article for Offsite Construction magazine, and I was drawing a parallel to the automotive industry in the 50s, 60s. So I think I'm going to get some of my numbers wrong, but I think in 1961 there were 900 car manufacturing companies in the UK, churning out around 900,000 vehicles a year. And by 1977 there were just 4. And those 4 companies were churning out 2.7 million vehicles a year. And that was because they'd invested in manufacturing equipment, manufacturing capability, and manufacturing design. So you couldn't compete if you were operating, making hand-carved cars in a shed, unless you're a company like Morgan and made a niche from doing that real high-quality stuff. So, you know, I don't think there are going to be the same number of companies. I think they will look different. From my perspective, I'd really like it if they owned the design, they owned the supply chain, the assembly, they worked with strategic partners, and they worked in collaboration on new platform development.
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, 10 years isn't necessarily a long time. It's a cycle. So whether or not there'll be vast amount of change in the top 20, I probably don't think so. I think also the modular element is still a relatively small chunk of the overall amount of construction that needs to happen. We saw on those slides, even if we produce 40 factories and, we're only talking about 5% of the housing needs. And if we're purely talking about the housing needs, I think, yes, it can add a significant quantity of additional supply, but will it overtake the traditional? I'm not quite sure. As I say, 10 years isn't long to change people's perceptions, and there still will be a market for the traditional market. So I think you might be starting to see, us creeping into the top 10, but would there be a wholesale change? Probably not in 10 years. I think, just because the scale of the need out there.
I think, from my point of view, it might be more about new entrants into the market. So we have a top 20 contractors list, and they all pretty much build traditionally, and some of those contractors are adopting offsite and some interesting techniques. But we saw a slide of the Katerra factory in the US up earlier. They're a tech company that are doing the whole of that supply chain, and I think that if you look at any other manufacturing process, and if you accept that this is manufacturing, that there are opportunities here for people to enter the market and completely overtake us. So we look at the likes of some of those big tech companies like Amazon and Google and what they're doing to disrupt other sectors. They're in everything. They're investing in off-site manufacturing, interestingly, as well. So I think what we might see is new entrants in that top 20 within the next 10 years that are approaching things in a very different way, and actually doing that as a tech company, not as a contractor.
Brilliant. Yeah. Fantastic question. Thank you. Anyone else from the floor? Yes. There's a microphone on its way to you.
Hello, good afternoon. What is the capacity of the industry to provide these extra homes by way of offsite? You've got the government push, but is there any capacity from the existing manufacturers that they actually can deliver these, or is it just like the government saying one thing and has got no idea about what the industry capacity is, whether that pipeline can be satisfied, whether it's now, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, unless more factories are built or more new suppliers come in the market? Because from my understanding from what you've got there is that the guys who are making it, they've got enough that they are building for themselves. They haven't got capacity to build for anybody else.
Do you want to pick that up?
I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, if you go into the marketplace, I think there's two issues. There's a capacity issue. So most of the off-site manufacturers are busy at the moment, and they're not working across all sectors. So as we see a push into the residential sector, actually the capacity for those manufacturers to meet demand is an issue. And the other issue, I think, is that if you look at those business models of those manufacturers, they're all pretty small. So even the largest of those manufacturers is turning over a very small proportion of what our tier 1 and tier 2 contractors are. So I would say there isn't much capacity in the sector at the moment, but building a pipeline will allow that investment, and also more automation and more standardization will allow those businesses to be more productive in what they're producing. And at the moment, I can't remember, I did read it somewhere, but I think if all of those modular manufacturers turned to residential overnight and stopped doing all the other things they were doing, might have a 3 or 4% impact on our housing delivery.
So actually, one of Matt's slides touched on this idea of platforms, components that get used across sectors. And it's one of the things that the IPA Call for Evidence talks about. I think that's one of the things that will potentially cut across this need for kind of vertical integration, that will start dealing more further down at the supply chain. I'm also, it slightly frustrates me that people still seem to talk about housing and everything else as though they're completely different problems, and that modular is right for housing and not for anything else, and vice versa. I think that's one of our blockers in the industry, is that we think too much in terms of sectors. And actually what the IPA talks about is this idea that if we got common components that could make anything, wouldn't matter whether it's housing or whatever, we can solve all these things. The more actually we use the common components, the more we solve things simultaneously, rather than going, right, that's housing sorted, I've still got hospitals and schools and everything else. So I'm just conscious we're running out of time. We're probably time for one more question from the floor. Any burning questions? Go on, sir.
Hi. Is that on? In the past, there's been problems funding for modular homes or so prefabricated, especially in the residential. Has that changed now? Is it recognised more by mortgage companies to fund it?
So on our flagship scheme in New Islington, we had 43 properties and around 20 different mortgage lenders, ranging from everything from high street lenders to boutique. I think there still is a certain stigma. And it was interesting what we're talking about, sort of the word prefab and urban splash. We sort of, back when we started doing mill conversions, urban was a sort of derogatory term. It was urban decay, urban blight. And I think there's something to be said about actually taking back words like prefab and actually owning them to change people's perception. Because there is still that perception out there, but it's very different. And we would challenge anybody to walk in one of our show homes up and down the country, which is Newcastle to sort of Birmingham, and the look on everyone's face when they get up on top floor is never, oh, this is prefab. It's always of, wow, this is pretty good. And by the time they've got up to the third story, it's they've forgotten all about the fact it was made in a factory.
So last one from me, just whipping down the panel. So if you could name or list one big opportunity benefit you think that will arise out of all this, whether it's productivity, quality, ability to tackle the market, whatever it is, and one blocker, what would it be? Start with Mark.
I'd really like to see better products. The blocker I could imagine is there currently is no single method of manufacture that you could use, and there are lots of people with lots of different solutions, and the perfect solution is going to be impossible to achieve. So to some extent, it's what is the right compromise that gives the benefit of standardization. And the one that I'd draw back to is shipping containers. You know, when they defined the size of a shipping container and the way that they work, was it correct? Probably not. But the fact that it was fixed from that point forward has affected everything from our furniture and our roads and the vehicles on them. So, yeah, that is a big blocker to overcome.
I think for me it's around productivity, and I do see that with an ageing workforce and an industry that's running at capacity at the moment, that if we don't tackle our productivity issues, then we're going to deliver even fewer homes than we are at the moment. And this is a great opportunity. It feels like we're at an implementation stage to me, where we've got digital technologies, we've got manufacturing improvements, so on, all coming together at the same time, and we should take advantage of that. I think as a blocker, I think we're at that point where people need to make that leap, and people don't necessarily want to be first. So I think some stimulation in the terms probably from government and incentivising people to adopt this form of construction is what we need.
I think in terms of opportunity, it's probably customer choice, perhaps. Surprisingly, as a developer, we've effectively stopped offering choice because of it leading to huge opportunities for human error. And, you can see what Splash have done, offering choice, which has been generated through the digital tools and offsite manufacturing. So that's where we hope to get to, and obviously we're slightly bigger pipeline, so the opportunity for choice there is much greater. In terms of the blocker, I think it's for us, and it's a very sort of specific perspective, but the supply chain maturity is a concern. I think we are pretty certain we will have to directly invest in new supply chain and establish new supply chain, because we're not convinced the existing construction supply chain will get where we want them to be fast enough.
For myself, it's probably a bit more joined up thinking from central and local government. There's a big push on the central for off-site manufacturing. We're finding a local level a bit of sort of pushback against it, particularly in the planning department. It's still seen as sort of not in my backyard, which is proving a little bit difficult. But the opportunity is volume. if we can get the volume there, then actually we can drive efficiencies. If we can get anywhere close to what the car manufacturers are doing in terms of volume, then that's when we can start delivering a far superior product at a cheaper price, and that's the holy grail.